So I suggest we take a handful of questions now so the panel can get back and also have the opportunity to come back to the Minister. But also Duncan needs to leave pretty soon. So if any of you have specific questions for Duncan, ask it now. So let me take a question from there, from Taylor.
Oh, sorry. Taylor Brown. My question is both for the bank and for the Minister, which goes back to Lenny's point, which was about being adaptive or taking this sort of approach that's apparent in the report requires a fundamental shift or a shift from a command and control sort of approach to one that is more learning, more adaptive, more flexible. At the same time, there are headwinds from against international development and challenges related to keeping things simple and focusing and delivering on sort of basic results within development. So I wonder how it is that DFID and the bank can balance those, which goes back to the point that I think Marta raised in her question.
Thank you very much. And we've got Sheila and Brett, and then I'll come to on the other side in the next round. Let me just get back to the panel on the first. Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI. I really wanted to take the opposite point of view from Duncan. So I think this goes too far towards being clear. I thought I was just misinterpreting the introduction, but the final anecdote about Mauritania actually illustrates this. If the World Bank discusses something with Mauritania, that's not influence, that's power. And I think there's a real problem in the whole discussion of definitions, of where the boundary is between influence of power, of where it is between democracy and clientelism. The example you give that clientelism is responding to what voters want. Well, yes, it may be, but on the other hand, what else do you do about voters? And the function and form and the rule of law. I don't actually believe, as a matter of fact, that every society aspires to the rule of law. Many aspire to getting things done, regardless of the law. And your assumption that we should be dealing with function, not form, goes a very long way in that direction. Now, I know you see the difference. You can tell the difference when you see it, like pornography. But I do think that we need to be a little more careful about drawing these lines, because other people will draw them in different places. And your cover shows that it's all a matter of perspective, but still.
Okay, thank you. One more there. Then I'll come back to the panel, including to Duncan, because he needs to leave, and then we'll get another round on this side, I promise.
Yes. When I read...
Sorry, can you all introduce yourselves before?
Teddy Brett, London School of Economics. When I read political science in 1956, I read John Stuart Mill, Representative Government, which stated that the rule of law, democracy, and all of these processes were essential for effective development. Nothing has changed. He was right then. The World Bank is right now. If we can get a society that practices these processes, we're clearly going to be better off than if we can't. The political problem is the problem of managing conflicting interests. And I think the minister's example of what that means in terms of this notion that somehow including more people in the political process is the solution is problematic. Because, of course, what politics is not about compromise and getting people to collect. It's about controlling excessive demands. We have a society in which very poor people want more things. They can't have them. Politics is mainly about stopping them from having them, but also managing a system which enables different groups to compete in ways that are satisfactory to them. So we need to recognize that politics is about managing conflict. And managing conflict means dealing with different groups that are competing. And classically, what we're trying to do in Mosul is to kill an inclusive political group that have got in the way. And what we're trying to do elsewhere is to help them. So that's what the whole process is about. The question is we need to understand that process better and recognize that we are also a political agent in that process.
Thank you. Sorry, we need to try to keep the questions a bit short to make sure others have the chance. Can I get back to the panel and specifically to Luis Felipe and Duncan, he's leaving, and others can come back in the second round. And also I know that Luis, you wanted to get back to the Minister on some of his questions.
Time is short, so I will try to be brief, but address some questions that are related to these comments to the question of the Minister. For example, about the idea of whether this is an excuse for inaction. I want to emphasize one of the elements we discussed in the report is this idea of reshaping the preferences. And yes, I mean, we can agree that the World Bank has the influence of sitting down at the table and talking to the people. But it matters what you do in that, what you say and how you do it. And the idea of trying to reshape the thinking, going, instead of saying this is the best practice you should implement, you should take this best practice. The idea of putting in, in the people's mind the idea that policy process matters as much as policy outcome is very important, and maybe the effect is not immediate. And this reshaping of preferences, we always mention this point that if we talk among economists and certainly within the bank, and you mention power, most people think you are talking about electricity. This change in the way we think is not trivial, and it's important that we give more structure to the idea of why power matters. Yes, we know. I mean, we know. If you have read Adam Smith and Marx, maybe there is nothing new in social sciences. But the point is, it matters on how you shape the way people discuss these issues in our institutions. So one final point is, if you think that this idea that the development process is uneven and generates tensions constantly, which has been discussed here, and the way you adapt to those tensions at the margin leads you in one path or the other, then what you do is as important as what you don't do, because it leads you to that different path. So in that sense, inaction is not an option, because you need to decide how you adapt to those tensions. Otherwise, you are basically going in a path that is not perhaps the one you want to have. So that would be my point in terms of inaction. This perspective is rather the opposite. The idea is that inaction is not an option. But I would leave it there.
Thank you. We'll come back to the question. Duncan, do you have anything to add at this point?
Just one final thought. Huge thanks for the contribution. It's been really interesting, and for the report. It would be in keeping with the spirit of the report if what happens next is more sort of providing the report as a platform on which different things emerge, rather than trying to control the process from now on. And I think it might also be more feasible, given the political economy constraints within the bank and within aid agencies, to somehow make this a public good and see what people do with it and encourage that process. And that might produce better results than trying to make this an advocacy campaign run by the bank.
We'll hear from Debbie from the bank in a minute on some final reflections. Thank you. Let me open to the floor again, and I'll start on this side this time. Remember to be here at the front, and then Peter, remember to say who you are. And if there are audiences online who want to pose a question, please do. I'll read them out.
Yes, I'm Shaheen Anam from Bangladesh. I'm a development practitioner. I work on human rights and governance in the field, where we experience people's fundamental rights being violated because of lack of governance, and that's putting it very, very broadly. My question is to the World Bank that congratulations for this report, but how will it change the way the country office works in the country? How will it inform? And that it's a question that the minister asks is, how do we embed it into the institutions? And unless that happens, I don't know how this, how we take this report, because I know the bank has made a huge commitment to citizens' engagement, but at the field level, we don't see that happening. So will this report help World Bank to negotiate differently with the government?
Thank you.
That is my question. And to Dr. Mushtaq about incremental changes. We are a bit kind of impatient with the incremental changes because we do a lot of work at the grassroots level, bringing about institutional changes at the policy, at the supply side. And, and there are great examples of institutions, the strengthening of institutions, using social accountability tools, and yet it remains incremental and it does not impact that commitment that is required at the top level.
Thank you. The mic is. Thank you very much. The question at the back, please, and then another one at the back here. Please keep it quite short if you can, so we can take a few more contributions.
Okay, thanks. I'm Peter Owen. I'm formerly a DFID governance advisor, now retired. These ideas are very familiar. I had a question for the Minister and the Bank. Given that you're going to emphasise a more adaptive approach and learning more about the environment you're working with and experimenting, how are you going to find the bureaucratic space for this and to square it with the enthusiasm for quote-unquote results, bearing in mind that governance is a 500-year process? And after sort of 3 or 4 years of this adaptive business, you might not have very much more than some subtle changes in the policy environment and a better understanding. Are you going to be able to take on the Daily Mail and get some more support for this sort of approach?
Thank you. A few questions in there. Is there any questions here at the centre? Oh, sorry, one at the back there, yes.
Hi, Chris Swallow, Active Strategy. Taking from your point, Minister, and looking at the sort of wringing of hands we had in Syria of who do we support, do we think we need a fundamental look at what the political settlement is? Do we need to look at a different way of understanding that in broader governance?
Okay. Thank you. Let's get back to the panel and then back to the audience in a minute. Let me start with Mushtaq. There are a couple of questions directed to you, and I'm sure you will have something to say about this question of political settlements, and then the Minister, Luis, and maybe Lenny on this, also on the question of whether this adaptation leads to anything concrete.
Thank you. I think that question about the political settlement is critical because I think it's been misunderstood, by many practitioners as some kind of agreement that elites sign. And if you can get people to sign something and have an agreement, that's your political settlement. I think this is a really fundamental misconception. To me, a political settlement does not have to be underpinned by any formal agreements at all. A political settlement is simply a distribution of power between groups and interests in a society that is viable in the sense that it is reproducible because the rents that the different groups are capturing is reproducible. In other words, it's linked to some productive process that allows the system to reproduce. If you don't have that, you can have any number of agreements and it will collapse after 2 days. And if you look at countries which are advanced countries, you don't see any formal agreement between the elites. But these countries are reproducing with intense rivalry between different interests and different parties, and yet there is a commitment to a rules-based society. Why? Because the way the way the rights are constructed, the access to rents is reproducible, right? This is the challenge. So when the minister asked the question about who to include, the question about who to include is not about, there are people outside the tent and they should be inside the tent, but if we include these people, is that a viable system? And in contexts like Iraq and Syria and so on, the real problem is you don't have a productive economy. So if you don't have a productive economy and you include people, it's really about redistributing a fixed set of rents which are coming from oil or aid or something, and that's not viable. So I think what people really need to start thinking in very creative ways is combining productive agendas with the inclusion strategy. In other words, you need to include people who are actually going to bring something to the table in terms of what they're producing, even if it is really trivial stuff. And then you can construct a political settlement. So please do not think of political settlements as agreements between elites. This is not the right way of thinking about it.
The question of incrementalism, don't you?
The question of incrementalism is, unfortunately, I'm more with Peter. I mean, this is a long-term process. If you look at the history of Europe and the history of advanced countries, things took a very long time to get better, but this doesn't mean inaction. So all the stuff that you are doing and others are doing in Bangladesh is extremely important. And here I would just add something about the political settlement and inclusion. So in a place like Bangladesh, you have a regime that is excluding people, but the people they're excluding could be included and the system would be more stable. In other words, Bangladesh is not like Syria or Iraq. It's a viable economy, and there are people who are being excluded who, had they been included, would have resulted in a more stable system. So inclusion is not always a bad thing. Inclusion is a vitally important part of creating more stable systems, and that's precisely the analytical tool we need to understand. In this case, is the exclusion damaging for political sustainability, in which case we should be pushing for inclusion. In other cases, it might not be the right answer right now, and a much more emphasis on production and productivity might be the answer.
Thank you.
So this is extremely important discussion.
Thank you. And on that note, maybe let's get to the Minister with a couple of questions that touches on your example.
Let me just try to nuance a little bit. I mean, I completely understand where Mushtaq is coming from, but I think my emphasis would be a little bit different. I think it's dangerous to imagine this purely in terms of a productive, growing economy and the distribution of rents, as though fundamentally you can understand politics in these contexts in terms of whether the pie is growing and how much of the pie you get. These guys that I'm talking about, the Sadrine, for example, trying to get into the room, yes, maybe some of them are basically interested in trying to get more cash for their supporters, but that isn't the way that it actually comes across on a day-to-day basis. In fact, what people are really talking about are often issues of religion, issues of social norms, issues the position of foreigners in their society. I think this was maybe even the mistake potentially of the Remain side in the Brexit campaign. They imagined that people are fundamentally motivated by Treasury documents on exactly what GDP growth is going to be or what impact it's going to have on your incomes. Economists maybe think like that. I think actually creating an inclusive settlement, it's not enough to have a growing economy and to think about how you distribute the cash within that growing economy. What makes it so difficult is it's often about a clash of values, including in many of these countries, clashes of religious values. But that's a nuance on Mushtaq's point. On the broader issue of how you create bureaucratic space in order to do this is very tough. My gut instinct is that we need to really invest in building up our own capacity within government to have people who spend much longer periods in other people's countries, who are prepared to take more risk in terms of security, spend less time in guarded compounds, put more energy into learning local languages. That involves having, and learning languages not just because of linguistic ability it gives you, but because the practice of spending 12 months living in someone else's country learning the language is very important for developing your cultural understanding. And in order to do this, you need to have more staff. You probably need to contract out less. It's very tempting to imagine that you can simply we don't need to speak this language fluently because there's somebody in the LSE who speaks this language fluently, so we'll give them a 6-month contract and somehow that will make us speak the language fluently. So having these things developed and really making the argument for why it matters to the world and the public that over the next 20, 30 years we have these capacities and we learn who to valorize and praise. I mean, I think the way we get this cultural change is by saying, here is an amazing example of somebody working for UNICEF or ICRC in the field, or this is an amazing example of a civil society organization in Bangladesh. These are the ways in which we would like you to operate. This is the kind of knowledge we'd like you to have. This is the kind of engagement with communities we'd like you to have. Thank you.
Thank you. Lenny, one final word from you, including what you just heard from the Minister, reflecting what you've seen from within DFID and other organizations.
Thank you. I mean, I think for those who are interested in whether donor agencies like DFID can take some of these ideas on board, I would say you can read our report. There are copies outside and it will be online later this week, which essentially reflects on what we have seen kind of following this process over the last couple of years. And I would say, it's a sort of glass half full at the moment. To me, I think there are a whole range of projects and programs that are applying some of these ideas in different sectors around different issues. There are interesting shifts being made to think about kind of how procurement processes work, how results measures are constructed to reflect some of this. But I think, as the Minister has said, it's true that that agencies are still falling down in terms of whether they really have that local knowledge, understanding and connections to think about how they genuinely facilitate sort of locally led change. And to me, what's needed to address that is this really needs to be embedded at sort of strategic levels. It requires senior leaders and managers at different levels to really be creating a culture that it has an expectation of learning of that local knowledge, that rewards it and prioritizes it. And that's the sort of future reform agenda. Again, there's lots on paper that supports this, but I think it's putting it into practice that matters.
Thank you. And I couldn't think of a better way to hand over to Deborah Wetzel for some closing remarks. Deborah is the Senior Director of the Governance and Global Practice of the World Bank, and so it couldn't be a better place to offer some final thoughts about how we take this agenda forward and what's next for the WDR. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you so much. Is this on already?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yes, I inherit the report as the Senior Director for Governance at the World Bank. But first, let me start by thanking the Minister for being here with us. You bring some incomparable experiences to be able to help us think through the report and the challenges. Let me also express my deep gratitude to DFID and to ODI, not only for hosting us here today, but for being partners with us for many decades. I've been in the business for 3 decades. Every region I've been in, every place I've been, I know ODI fellows, and I work closely with my DFID counterparts. And your interaction with us as an institution has been really fundamental, particularly with the work we do related to governance. And finally, a very heartfelt thank you for your support on IDA 18 and our agenda related to fragile and conflict states. These are extremely important issues for us and will be driving forward the work we do. Also, my thanks to Marta, to Lenny, to Mushtaq, and to Duncan for the comments. We work with you, you prod us, make us think, and it's a dialogue that's extremely important to us. So a few things from the perspective of the bank. There's been a lot said today about how the report legitimizes this work in the community. It's important to recognize that the report also plays a role within the World Bank. So Luis Felipe started by saying, we do these world development reports, they give 20 years of a stock take, but then they set the agenda. And there is work to be done for us within the institution to say, okay, here are some thoughts. Here's how we are looking at these issues related to governance, power, politics, and what they mean for how we do our business. Formally, we are not a political institution. We cannot be a political institution. We have a very diverse board of directors, formally. Okay, so there was a qualifier. Practically speaking, we know that we're on the ground engaging and that we have a role in our interactions with governance and governments. Many of our colleagues work in sectoral areas and country areas, and so one of the big challenges for us is to think through how within the bank and outside of the bank we disseminate and work on the report. To think through these concepts, work through incremental nature versus big bang, technical solutions versus understanding how particular concepts may take hold in the imaginations of our colleagues. So the 3 C's for some people are going to be meaningful and useful. For others, they will find these concepts of exclusion, capture, and clientelism something that is more real. And then the challenge to us is, okay, we've identified these as issues. How do we help our colleagues, be they country staff on the ground or sectoral staff working on the real power, electricity, education, health, transport, you name it. How do we help them identify and think through how those dysfunctions affect results and how we might be able to work on the positive aspects of governance, be it trust, legitimacy, cohesiveness. How do we help engender those type of things? So for us, it's very important as a report on governance. It is even more important as a point of interaction between us and our colleagues. So this message of getting governance out of its bubble is extremely important because this is really about how you make public policy, which is fundamentally about governance, but it's also about a lot of other things and how we do what we do. So that will be important and something for us that's keen to be thinking about. We are in a world of rapid change. So as we talk about all the old style types of governance and politics and John Stuart Mill and others, the thing that we're also thinking about is how technology is changing this equilibrium. So you see whether it's people on their phones, whether it's atomistic interaction, coordination across groups, thinking about how that changes the dynamic and amplifies things both positively and negatively is another factor that we're trying to think about and weigh in. We have a lot of ideas about how we might go forward working on this. I guess the most useful thing to say is that the suggestion that Duncan made about having some type of platform, there's a lot in this report. So you can read it 10 times, 20 times, 50 times. You'll find every chapter, everything. It gets better with age is what I've been telling the team. And so how we take the different pieces of it, how each chapter contributes to this discussion is something that it makes sense to have a platform around knowledge, around sharing, around ideas. Responding to the specific questions, how are we going to use this on the ground with our country directors? How are we going to change the way we do business? I joke with the team that we need to apply the report to the bank. So what do decision makers say? How do we interact with them? How do we get country directors to understand that even though, yes, they deal with the politics day in and day out, there may be systematic ways in which they can think about it that could help them change how they program their activities. Yes, we're keen on looking at more adaptive and flexible approaches, but the pressures that were raised by Peter, I guess, are real. So the balance between results and just, okay, let's be flexible is not something we can ignore given our authorizing environment. So there's a whole set of things that we will want to engage with you to work on, to think through how we take the great ideas in this report forward, how we evolve them and implement them within the bank, but then also how we engage with our partners both here and on the ground to be able to advance and make progress, which by default will be incremental. I mean, I also am a fan of the manifesto for incrementalism. Is that what you called it? So anyway, let me stop there, but we really will work closely with you and others in terms of how we take forward the content of the report.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. So it's just past 11:30. Despite what this watch says, I realise my colleagues now put a watch was about 5 minutes fast, so you get the pressure. Let me thank on behalf of ODI, Alex and myself and everyone, the audience online and here and the panel, the World Bank and DFID for partnering with us in this event and more broadly on this agenda for so long and for so many years to come to make it a reality, and especially the Minister. For the time, for staying, and for particularly sharing with such honesty and candor his reflection, which I think is invaluable. My final thought is we had, glass half full or half empty is always a lively debate. I would say that the fact that this is the second time in a year that we had a state minister come to ODI to talk about those issues in relation to policy and policy making is very significant. We've been talking about this agenda on policy and governance for a long time. It's now part of what we're all trying to do, and to have politicians interested in engaging the debate is new, is tangible, is something that proves that this matters and it has a life ahead. So with that note of optimism, thank you very much. Until next time you come to it.